Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Um, thank you for that introduction. My name is John Rountree, as Francesco just said. I am an assistant professor, newly minted from the University of Houston downtown. I actually feel kind of weird because a member of my dissertation committee is here, John Gastel. I went to graduate school at Penn State, but I'm an assistant professor of communication, and my subfield specialty is rhetoric, hence the title, or the subtitle rather, that it's a rhetorical analysis of 2 citizens initiative reviews in Oregon. So, I'm really excited to get to talk to you all because I went to the Deliberative Democracy Summer School. I got to meet a lot of you. I was there as a mentor, as a respondent, as a chair, but I didn't get to talk through my own research, and so I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk through it with you all. Not least of which, you know, a lot of the research y'all are doing at the center I thought was very impressive, and I feel like y'all could help me out with some of the lingering questions I have on this research that I'm dealing with. So my plan for the presentation, I'm a public speaking teacher, as I mentioned earlier, so I feel like I have to be really structured when I give a presentation. My plan here, I'm first going to give some background on rhetoric. I'm then going to review the exigence for the research, so the purpose behind my research, what's driving it. I will talk through my research design. I'll outline my key findings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the discussions, the implications, and then I'm going to raise some questions that I hope we can talk through on what to do for further research. Now, if that sounds like a lot to do in 30 minutes, I promise you I have a timer in front of me, and I'm going to keep myself honest. Like I said, as someone who teaches public speaking, I understand that asking an audience to sit through more time than you allocated for the presentation can be frustrating, to say the least. So I'll try to keep myself honest with this timer. So also there's a little outline in the top right in case you want to keep up with where we are in the presentation. So when I came to Canberra, I realized, you know, there are some people who know about rhetoric, who talk about rhetoric, but there seemed to be a little bit of a divide between the way rhetorical studies talks about rhetoric and the way I've heard it talked about in deliberation. So I just wanted to clarify, sort of as a rhetorician, as someone who is in the field of rhetorical studies, what I mean by rhetoric versus some of what I've heard people in deliberation studies talk about as rhetoric. So in deliberation research, we have things like Iris Young in her book, Inclusion and Democracy, she says rhetoric involves the various ways something can be said, which color and condition its substantive content. So there's a tradition of viewing rhetoric as like a stylistic addition onto substantive ideas. Or I know in Dreisek's essay, he talks about rhetoric involves persuasion and its variety of forms. So this is kind of an Aristotelian notion of rhetoric as persuasive speaking. And this isn't wrong. I'm not here to quibble about definitions. I just want to clarify sort of where people in rhetorical studies are coming at this from. Within rhetorical studies, we take a much broader view of what rhetoric involves. So some of the definitions will sound extremely broad compared to some of what you might be used to. For example, Krista Ratcliffe defines rhetoric as how we use language and how language uses us. Extremely broad definition. You've got Sonia Foss in her book, which is used in a lot of undergraduate classrooms. She defines rhetoric as the human use of symbols to communicate. So to some rhetoricians, right or wrong, to some rhetoricians, rhetoric is almost synonymous with communication. So a lot of times I've seen in deliberation research, people will talk about, should we incorporate rhetoric? Can rhetoric be part of it? And to rhetoricians, this is almost a nonsensical proposition because rhetoric is communication. And so to say rhetoric can't be, should rhetoric be part of it, doesn't make sense if you think of rhetoric as the substance of discourse. So I just wanted to clarify those definitions. Again, it doesn't mean that there's an official definition. These are always, especially when you're in a field called rhetorical studies, these are always essentially contested concepts that are debated quite widely. Well, I wanted to clarify where I'm coming from. I also need to give a shout out in case you're not familiar with it. There is a field of rhetoric and deliberation in the United States. So there's actually a book series called Rhetoric and Democratic Deliberation out of Penn State Press that looks at really interpretive research on how public discourse is discussed over prominent policy debates usually. There's also a lot of theorizing going on. So it's funny, whenever I'm in front of the rhetoricians, I say, y'all got to read some of the stuff coming out of deliberative democracy. And when I'm in front of y'all, I'm saying you got to read some of the stuff coming out of rhetoric. So the exigence for this research, what's driving my research agenda right now? I'm really concerned about the complexity of public policy problems and how that might create barriers to lay understanding. This is a really big, thorny issue, I think, if we're talking about deliberation, which leads to, hopefully, informed judgment. But sometimes I describe it like to my colleagues like this. Walter Lippmann has this passage in The Phantom Public where he says, citizen sovereignty is a complete fiction. He says citizens cannot know enough to really reasonably engage in policy debate. You know, he even just like, what are they going to study traffic patterns on Wednesday and then study environmental concerns on Thursday and then study financial reform on Friday? He says this is an unrealistic idea. But we know, based on deliberation research, that we can improve people's ability towards informed judgment. We know that people increase things like their sense of political efficacy. We know their knowledge about policy issues increases. We know that their single peakedness increases on the consistency of their preferences. So we know that deliberation can help with some of these matters, but I'm interested mostly in how that can work, how that can better be implemented. And I think this has become even more pressing for me in the current situation where we have the coronavirus going on, and there's been these different responses to expertise. So for some in the United States, you know, there's almost been a dismissal of expertise, even having the president of the United States saying, maybe you should inject disinfectant. And at the same time, I worry actually that on the other side, there's been a lapse into a kind of technocracy where we just say, well, we need to do whatever the experts tell us to do on this policy matter, where we've almost passed the buck to technical experts. Now, this isn't just a concern, though, for scientific issues. I think this is a concern across the board: legal issues, economic issues. The complexity of policy issues, it would seem, is a really important barrier that we need to address. So my research question for this specific study is how do lay participants in a deliberative setting judge competing technical claims? So before I even get into the sort of the prescriptive stuff, how should they do it? How should they do this work? I wanted to know more about what they are actually doing when we put them into this situation. What kind of practices are they engaged in? And how are they trying to sort out what's true and what's not? So my research design, I wanted to use a case study from the Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, I'm going to tell you. So the CIR, it's based on a citizens jury design. The whole purpose of the CIR is to provide voters with reliable information about a ballot measure. So these ballot measures would come up in Oregon and people would vote on them during election time, but a lot of times either they didn't know what they were voting on, or there would be all these misinformation campaigns. Really, you know, you'd have one ad saying, this is what's true. You'd have another ad that was saying, this is what's true. This is what will happen with the ballot measure. You know, this is the implication of the ballot measure. And so in Oregon, Democratic activists worked to create a process whereby a panel of citizens would come together and try to sort out some of these competing technical claims about ballot measures. And ultimately, they would create a one-page citizen statement that would outline key findings about the measure. So what are some claims that are true about the measure? They would outline maybe some background information that was important. And then they would outline the best arguments for and against the measure. The participants would be 20 to 24 stratified random selected people from across Oregon. The duration, This has been done several times. So it started out as a 5-day process. It's transitioned to a 4-day process, but it's been done both ways. And the format is exactly what we would expect with a high-quality deliberation. There's neutral facilitators. They bring in background witnesses that are supposed to provide more information, more expertise. There are advocate teams, so there's a pro team and a con team. And they have a small and large group discussion. And 4 to 5 days, but it's 8 hours a day. So this is a really grueling process for participants going through in deep detail these different claims about these ballot measures. And this is just kind of what they produce. So I was showing you some images of some of the sections of the citizen statement. Like they would have a key findings section like this, where they would have bullets underneath outlining some of the main information that they found, background, a citizen statement in support, where they outline best arguments for, and a citizen statement in opposition, where they would outline the best arguments against the measure. So for my data, I used full audio and transcripts from 2 different 2012 CIRs. I actually came into this project a little late, so I wasn't even in graduate school in 2012. And I came into graduate school, and John Gastel, who's in this chat now, he invited me to join something called this CIR Research Collaborators. And apparently they'd been collecting data on the CIRs for a long time. And he said, well, we've got a lot of data from past CIRs. Please, go back, look at some of this data, analyze some of this data to see what we can find. And I chose the 2 from 2012 because it had the fullest data set on the audio and transcripts. So it had full audio of both the small group discussions and the large group discussions. John told me, I mentioned to him, oh, you can talk about the CIR, you can answer some technical questions. And he said, John, I'm going to be too sleepy for that. It's nighttime in the United States. So the 2 measures I looked at, it was measure 85, which would repeal a corporate kicker tax credit. And then there was measure 82, which would have lifted the ban on private casinos. Now remember, even though some of the issues we may think about as the most technical or scientific, still economic expertise has been problematic as well. In fact, there's some research on the public getting confused and shut out of deliberative processes by constructions of economic expertise. There were 100 hours of audio and video and 2,500 pages of transcripts. So my analytic approach here, in rhetorical studies, we use something called rhetorical analysis. Sometimes this is referred to as rhetorical criticism because rhetorical studies actually emerged out of literary criticism. So it tends to be a more humanistic approach rather than a social scientific approach to analyzing discourse. So our approach is a loosely structured interpretive analysis. And we look at things like, we want to understand how communicators are framing an issue through their discussion, how they are making meaning out of their experiences, in this case through a deliberative process, through their discourse. And I wanted to note, because one thing I had to work through as I was doing this study is, in my discipline of rhetorical studies, typically there is no method section at all. People don't include method sections, but one of the things I've been trying to work on in this research is walking a line between 2 different audiences. So on the one hand, I'm trying to speak to some of the social scientists who tend to have a more rigorous methodological approach. And on the other hand, I'm trying to speak to rhetoricians who, if I go too far that direction, they're going to, in some senses, reject it. And so trying to find that middle ground has been one of the weird things I've tried to deal with in this project. And in order to try to find that middle ground, I developed a table to help guide the analysis, to help focus what pieces of this huge set of transcripts I was going to focus on for interpretive analysis. So because I'm interested in how panelists are how participants are resolving these technical claims through their discussions, I decided to make a table of the top 5 in both cases, most salient disputed factual questions in each panel. And this was an iterative process. So I went through once, listened to the full audio, and then I went back to notes, I went back to documentation, and I tried to capture, what was most disputed in these panels, such as, what will be the effect of crime rates on, what will be the effect on crime rates in gambling, or what will this measure do on tax reform? And then when I went back to the analysis, I tried to see in each case, where in the discussion were they trying to resolve this issue? Where did they find some sort of resolution when they were discussing whether this was true or not? So my key findings, this is the good stuff. This is what y'all want to hear. What did I find? Well, in their discussions, what seemed to emerge was a standard of verifiability to judge these competing technical claims. Verifiability, what does that mean? First of all, they did use the term. I'm not just imposing this term. This is a term that panelists themselves consistently used. It seemed to mean 2 things for them. One, that they would cite that a claim was attached to a cited reputable source. And 2, that it was attached to concrete evidential reference, meaning that they could easily tie a claim to something tangible in the world that they could point to. This leads them to certain types of claims that they deem more verifiable than others. So, for example, if they were talking about a legal interpretation, which did come up in one of the panels, they would want to see a legal document, something they could point to. On economic issues, they tended to like things that were countable. So it doesn't mean all numbers, but it means like, is there a concrete thing in the world that was counted in order to produce this? How many video lottery terminals are there? How much of the budget is allocated to this? So the idea for them was, this is something concrete that we can check. Now, verifiability in this case, that means that a claim could be verified, not necessarily that the participants themselves clarified it. Instead, it was important that it was the type of claim that they thought could meet that test of verification. Now, my supporting evidence on this, I looked in the analysis at 3 different communication practices that I thought were prominent in the discussions, but also really led towards this gold standard of verifiability. And I'll go through each of those in turn. And I'll also give an illustration, just a little piece of the discourse, just so you can understand the types of things that people are saying when I'm looking at this text. So the first thing that stood out to me is panelists would have meta commentary where they directly talked about their standards of evidence. They directly talked about what makes this piece of evidence good. And so whenever those kinds of discussions came up, they would immediately position verifiable claims as the stronger type of claims. So I would see things in the discourse like, the entire reason I think we went for this quote in the first place was that it was verifiable with a source that is a reputable source. Or once again, we need to verify the source, don't we? So that would be something that would be reliable information because it's something we can verify and something that we can go to. So consistently throughout the process, claims that were talked about in this way were elevated as more reliable, better claims for them to start to include in their deliberations and include in their final statement. But as I noticed that, I was wondering, well, maybe there's multiple standards. Maybe this is just one standard, and maybe there's another standard that crops up in the discussion that might be just as important. And in fact, when I was reading some of the essays on this very issue, one of the things that seemed to be suggested a lot was maybe we should use bias as a standard. Maybe instead we need to look at the motives of the source that is providing the information. So what was fascinating to me is that participants actually subordinated bias as a standard. They would bring up bias and then they would set it aside. They weren't as interested in the bias of a source. And I found that intriguing, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit in the discussion. But it's one of those things that makes me wonder if practice, it comes out a little differently than we had anticipated. So one of the cases where this cropped up, the participants in these panels had a chance to actually choose who came before them. So they were given a list of potential background witnesses, and under each person they had a lot of information. You know, who do you work for? What's your job? What kind of information would you be able to talk to us about? Do you have a position on this measure? Do you have any conflicts of interest here? So motives were kind of already baked into that background information. And there was a moment that I wanted to show you where they were trying to decide whether to bring someone before them who was biased. So here's that moment. W says, I'm going to guess without looking that she's very biased. Yeah, she has positions to support the measure. She wants to pass it, yeah. And she's also the one who works for our organ too, right? Or at least they're affiliated with it. They're affiliated, yeah. But then it takes a turn. I think that might be a good person to hear from, because we've been hearing from a lot of people on the other side. That's why I think it might be beneficial to hear from this person, because even today, when we tried to think of pros, we were at a loss to think of anyone that spoke to us today and tried to convince us. Well, we have very specific questions about what reserve funds are out there. Right, yeah, and that would be her. And she's an expert in budget and finance for schools, so it seems like she'd know that stuff. So bias often would come up in these discussions, as it did here. And then when they realize someone's biased, they also say, but there are overriding concerns. So we need to set bias aside, because she has things we need to, she has information that we need to hear. She would be an expert on this issue. We've only heard one perspective. We need to hear another perspective. And so I thought it was important to recognize not just that verifiability was being elevated, but that bias was itself being subordinated. The final practice I wanted to bring up is that panelists didn't always find resolution on the claims. So sometimes they said, we don't know, we're not sure. And yet they still put that in the statement. And so they kind of met their match and they passed the buck onto the voter to figure out. So for example, here, a couple of the claims in the casino measure where economists disagree on the long-term economic impact of private casinos in Oregon. So rather than say, this is what the economic impact is going to be, they simply stated up front, we're not sure, they disagree, or we perceive that they disagree. Or the second claim, they noted private casinos could negatively affect gaming revenues of the tribal casinos and the communities they support. Now, I realize that that could look like just a poorly phrased claim, but they discussed this for several minutes about whether to use the word will or could. And their argument was ultimately, will is too strong, we don't have evidence to support will, but we should alert people that maybe this could happen. But I wanted to look at a more concrete case from the transcript of what happened when they were discussing this second claim here. Why did they decide we can't make a call here? I know this is long, I apologize, but this person was talking about his frustration, and he said, I think that I still would like clarification on the financial impact, specifically on the revenue projections for a private casino and the anticipated impact on the Indian casinos, the new revenue versus the shifting of existing revenue notion. I'm still having trouble getting my head around the disparity between the numbers, or if there is a disparity at all. I think I just need to see more information on, are we talking about new money that is actually coming in or not? Because I think that really makes a big difference on the impact of how I would sign on. And someone asked, you mean from the economy guy that the Indians have? I said, yes, the economist. And I'm asking for clarification on what he said. Are you talking about, yeah. Yeah, because they each have an economist and they're essentially saying different things. Different things, you're right. Those are my two questions. And what documentation do they have to justify what they're saying? I'd like to see the research. So, I mean, there's a few things that are notable here. First, it does appear that even in a highly structured, lengthy deliberative situation like this, that competing experts can sow confusion if it seems like there's a balance between one economist saying this and another economist saying this. But what's also notable is the way they try to resolve this issue. The way they try to resolve it is say, well, where's your documentation? Where's your research? And so when they're faced with this, problem, they reach back towards that standard of verifiability. What can I point to say that this is true, this is not? So there's a few implications, I think, of verifiability as this emergent standard that came out in these discussions. One, I think it is positive to see participants in these trying to look for direct evidence to support some of these technical claims. And yet, it seems like, based on my analysis, claims that invoke complex causal relationships might be bypassed. It seems like if you're looking for something very concrete, something very like you could point directly to, not just research, but evidential reference, you might go for the low-hanging fruit rather than try to explain more complex relationships, such as like what will be the economic impact of this. And I think another important finding here is that if we're going to forward bias as a potential solution to evaluating technical claims, I think we need to realize that bias may presume an information-rich environment where participants have a lot of different choices over where they're going to get certain information. What I discovered during this process is that participants were often quite frustrated because they wanted there to be research on a specific thing and it didn't exist, or they didn't have direct research on that, or the best background witness they had was someone who did have bias. So as I wrap up, I have a few lingering questions from this research myself that, I'm happy to do Q&A, but I also want to talk about some of these questions because they've come up in my process of doing this research. So one question I had was, would this kind of analysis, would this pattern hold true if we were dealing with more salient, more polarizing policy issues? If we were dealing with something like gun control, if we were dealing with something like healthcare, where people have more formed opinions before they come in. I'm wondering if there are cognitive limits to even the most well-designed and thorough mini-public, and if so, does that present a problem for democratic deliberation? I've been struggling with how can we gauge, if we move this research forward, how can we gauge the efficacy of a mini-public in evaluating some of these competing technical claims? So it strikes me that maybe there's not an Archimedean point of view. Maybe there's not a standpoint on which to say, yes, they got it right, no, they didn't, without already sort of begging the question. So if you were to fact check them, for example, on what basis are you going to choose a fact checker? And does that not already presume how we decide what's true and what's not? Oh, sorry. And finally, just, the bigger question is, how can we build on this type of research to create a better foundation for lay deliberation on some of these technical policy issues? So those are the things I'm thinking about. I notice I'm just under time, so that's good. I hope you all have some thoughts, but I'm also happy to answer questions. But thank you all for listening.